strength strategies to help keep it that way. Um, yeah, so that's like the hard part about this is making things stick. Like I had somebody here yesterday, same kind of thing. She's in from Boston for the week to kind of work with me a few times and um, has a lot of twists and turns. And yeah, it was just like we had made some really good progress where you could visually see it in one session. But I need to kind of regroup. And when I see her again, make sure that I'm giving her strength strategies to keep it that way. If that makes sense. Like, I think that's just as important. Yeah. So, and then we'll talk about the connective tissue today, and how I think that plays a huge role because if you have more laxity, and that could be globally in your body or just in one area because you kind of created laxity in that area from constant loading with different link tension relationships, then it becomes really important to kind of think of how to train the connective tissue so you're regaining some of that suppleness and compliance and stiffness, all of those things, so that the joint itself can regain that integrity that it may have once had, but then kind of lost over time. Now, if you're dealing with an actual hypermobility diagnosis, that is a different animal. And on that front, I'm just thinking a lot about giving references all the time. And I would reference the fitness membership for that in terms of exercises and like trying to put hands on walls and foam rollers and bands and balls and all of that. But sometimes it's just a matter of doing your strength work in an optimized position so that the joint itself can regain that integrity that it needs, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Patty won't?
Getting, I have a question.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. I'm not able to understand the internal and external rotation of the hip with respect to pelvis IR and ER.
Say it again. Sorry, it kind of cut out a little bit.
Yeah, if the pelvis is in IR, what happens to femoral internal and external rotation? Can you explain that?
Yes. So let me get my model out. So if the innominate is in more IR, if I have a fixed femur, let's say I'm on a wall or my foot's flat on the ground and I'm in more relative IR, that creates more relative ER. So there's more IR available to go into. If I have a relative ER on a fixed femur, now the femur's already in internal rotation. So I'm going to have more ER, but I'm going to have less IR to go into. Now, if someone is in more ER, already in IR, and they have femurs that go into internal rotation and have more of that valgus presentation at the knee, then they're probably going to be very limited in IR because they only have so much left to go. This is from the concept of like how much space is left in each direction. Now, if someone has, let's say, more of an ER femur and they have lots of tension back here, they may be limited in ER because of the end range, because they're already in ER, or they could be limited in IR because there's a lot of muscular tension fighting on the opposite side. The difference when you're measuring it, if you do hip measurements, is that when you're feeling for the amount of range left within the joint, it feels like a hard end feel. Like as you push, it's like bone, not bone on bone, but it feels like that's it. Whereas like pulling to get the stretch on tension in the muscle feels like you could keep going, but there's just tension. And so kind of like for years, I did that testing for probably like 7 or 8 years. I would do a lot of passive range of motion testing. So it became easier to get that feeling. But you also have to make sure like when you're turning the femur in or out, that you're holding the pelvis in position, because a lot of times what can happen is the pelvis is like hiking up, especially if someone's hypermobile and you're trying to like, so I put my knee, I kind of jam it into the side a little bit just to hold the pelvis from popping up. And then I do the IR, ER. And I'm happy to show that at some point. Um, I just need somebody here with me to show, but honestly, like that's what I got away from that because if I look at what's happening at the shoulder, I can kind of use that to help me understand what's happening at the pelvis and the femur. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll have to again go through this whole presentation again to understand it better. I got some idea.
I think I also have in the portal, in that section where I'm kind of going over terminology, I think I might have gone over relative motion in that. I have a video on this somewhere in that portal. So let me look through, like where I just kind of recap just that, what you asked. Just remind me, and I'll go in there and look through.
Do you have any other explanation for, like you explained, like if there is limited IR or limited squat and toe touch, then it's more of toe of face, right?
If there's a limitation in IR, it's more of
No,
a,
limited toe touch and squat.
okay, if
Then
you
it's more of a toe of face of the gait.
yes. So the way I look at that, so if I'm limited in my toe touch, there's a couple things. I'm either really tight in the back of my pelvis, so I can't lean forward and get that length, or I'm already in a certain amount of hip flexion, meaning an anterior orientation. And so I only have so much range to go and I can't touch my toes anymore because I'm running out of flexion. Or I've lost that or I've lost the lumbar ability of the lumbar to go from extension to flexion. And so I don't have that capability. And that could also be like muscular, lots of tone within the back extensors. And so then I go down. So all of those things mean my center of mass is really forward. And same with the squat. If I can't get all the way down in the squat, let's say I'm getting to about 90 degrees, maybe I can open up the back of my pelvis. But then when I have to get all the way down to the bottom and orient my pelvis and get that posterior expansion, again, that's just telling me that I'm pushed forward in the gait cycle. So the answer for that is pulling the center of mass back. And two things are going to do that, which is opening up the back of the pelvis and opening up the back of the rib cage to get posterior orientation. And for some people, that can also mean regaining counter nutation with more ER, usually more of our wide infrasternal angles. But can be both, right? And for some people, it's getting more IR to help with nutation so they can get to that 90-degree range. But if you ask them to go down to the bottom, they may kind of skip that 90-degree range by just tucking under really quickly, not actually owning that range. More of the narrow, I guess.
I got a question. So when you got someone with a bigger belly and you got a more weight on the front, so when we say we want the pelvis to bring it up, do we need more strength in the hamstrings to pull the pelvis down, or is it more difficult for the people to bring that pelvis in a neutral position? So is it for them maybe like bring them more up with more strength and hold it more with, so it's more like a conscious lifting up? So I think like it's sometimes a lot of my clients are always in that anterior orientation. And so I know there's a lot of weight going on. So I'm not sure how much I can tell them to tuck under or going. So how can I support this? Or yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously, the more mass you have in the intrathoracoabdominal cavity, the more you're having to manage that pressure difference. So part of improving that position is weight loss, and obviously they're working on that sort of stuff. But remember, there's nothing wrong with an anterior orientation, especially if they can use their hamstrings and their abs and get into the opposite shape. So maybe because they're more often living in that position when they're walking around and just doing their daily activities, when you're doing exercises with them, you are working a little extra on those hamstrings and deep abdominals to help them manage that pressure and get that sense, but also to lubricate all the joints and get the spine in flexed positions, especially the lumbar, if it's never in that flexed position. So all of that is going to contribute to the joint health while their strength training to help with the weight loss, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be more difficult, but then constraints matter, right? If someone has already got 50 extra pounds, then they're lifting 50 extra pounds all the time. So I may not be adding a bunch of load to them. I may do something like a TRX squat. They're still going to be fatigued and working their muscles because when they go in that better position, they're not using their diaphragm to help them do the job. And so now their muscles are actually working harder by unloading them slightly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is my favorite presentation, by the way, because I love all things like jumping and power. And I think it's really, really important as we age. So we're going to talk about how to create coordination and how our connective tissue can act as a free energy spring and how we can actually improve and enhance the capabilities of the connective tissue, which is really kind of cool. So I'm not going to read all this. We're going to go through all of this today. This was originally a separate presentation I did for something else, and then I started including it in EP. So basically, we have kind of that parts and whole perspective, which we're going to come back to in 2 weeks and really talk about what that looks like in creating meaningful change for people in their bodies. But parts is sort of, I'm breaking things down. I am learning to change how I do something. So you're working with your client and they're doing this split squat here, this front foot elevated, and they're just hinging forward, and you can teach them how to get their body back in space. You can say, put more weight into your back foot, hold the weight out in front of you a bit farther. And their body, they're learning, they're getting that feedback from you, and they're learning how to do it differently. That's kind of a parts. We're breaking things down. Whereas a whole is the body has mastered the movement so well that there's, and it's too fast for there to be that feedback. So we call this open loop control. It's like your brain just remembers it all of the time. It's like riding a bike, right? Do you ever have, once you learned how to ride a bike, do you ever have to think about how to ride a bike? No, because your body just knows how to do it. And that's in a lot of performance and sports. We master these skills for so long, if you've played sports, that everything just becomes kind of automatic. So we want things that help us develop that open loop control and things that help us develop the closed loop, where in both of those things are important, but they kind of exist on that long spectrum. So movement behavior is the result of complex interactions between many different subsystems in the body, the task at hand, and the environment. So dynamic systems theory is something you can look more into. But if I give somebody a constraint and I say, hold this weight up in front of you, and my intention is that I want to get their center of mass back, or I put cones on the floor and I say, jump from this cone to this cone. And in that moment, the environment changes, maybe a loud noise, or the music starts, like shuts off or whatever. The environment is now going to change the outcome of that. And also the way that they perform it, just because they've never done it before. It may not be what you intended for them to do when you gave them that weight and said to hold it out, or when you put the cones out and you said jump from one to the other, and they do it differently than you anticipated in your mind. So human beings will self-organize, and I said this in the beginning of the course. All of you guys have a completely different movement lens and sense of movement in your body because of the activities that you grew up doing and you do today. And so that created an experience that's like a language that's mapped into your body that I will never understand. So I can try to help people create that connection and improve that language within their body, but I can really only see from my perspective. So when we're thinking about constraints and cues, it's important to think about variability. How do we come up with different ideas and unique ways to make the exercise suitable for somebody? When you see all these like crazy exercises I'm posting on Instagram, it's because my brain is like, well, how can I get this out of that? And da 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 da. It's not that I'm trying to just do an exercise for novelty. I'm thinking, why does Jennifer keep doing that with her hip every time she does a side lunge? And what can I do to make it and stop that from happening? And sometimes that means trying 4 or 5 different strategies until we find one that works. And then once we do, we keep using that strategy to build the strength. Okay. So there are things in your control, and then there are things that are not in your control, is basically, and the body is going to self-organize the best it can based on the information that that human being is bringing to the session. So open loop control and closed loop control, it's just, there is either no feedback, like I said, with the diver and the boxers and the tennis player, where they don't have time for that sensory processing. It's fast ballistic movement. And by getting good at those movements, it compensates for any shortcomings in proprioception. This is where we're using things like co-contractions, where we're learning to create tension in the entire lower limb or the upper limb. And by just learning that, we actually improve the output and the motor control that we have. Whereas a closed loop system is waiting for that feedback, either from themselves because they tried it or from us, their coaches, and then assessing for what errors they made and giving them that feedback and allowing them to process that and try it a different way. So this will be less accurate the faster we are, and harder to do if I'm lifting like super heavy loads. But if it's something where it's more slow and controlled and they can pay attention, then it works pretty well. But it does have some limitations. So if we think about, this is from Franz Bosch's book, and it's basically on the left-hand side, it's talking about proprioception. And a lot of times we're using exercises like in PT and training where less common now. I think people are understanding more about this, but where you're standing on a BOSU or an AirX pad. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's allowing the body to feel a little off and trying to see how it stabilizes. But what he's trying to say is that that the muscle spindles that are activated when we do things like that are actually less than when we're in a stable environment and we're learning to create tension from, in this case, the entire body from top to bottom. So his whole body is a co-contraction and he's creating as much tension as he can. And when we get good at doing those co-contractions, we actually fire more muscle spindles and we reduce that, we reduce the kinematic errors that we might otherwise have. So when there's a decrease in contact time and a decrease in processing time, we're going to probably do better by relying on exercises like this one on the right than exercises like this one on the left. Okay. So I'm not saying don't ever do those things. There probably is reasons, not within this presentation, but I don't know, Parkinson's, like things like that, where maybe you need that certain stimulus in different ways and it's important to train. So this is, you can look a little bit more into this motion reference learning, but it is the process of experiencing motor errors with respect to the actual states visited rather than the intended states. So imagine that I tell someone to do a box jump, and my intent is that when they do it, they land kind of high and stiff. So they kind of create that tension at the top of the box jump. But when they do it, they land in this super deep squat. Their brain now learned less about what I had intended and wanted them to learn than what they actually did. So a lot of times um, we can't account for this because, again, that person's unique movement experience is dictating a lot of the way that they're going to end up doing something. Over time, maybe we can get that result, but it's co-contractions and taking that need for that repetitive cueing and trying to get the right outcome away that actually allows us to have less errors in proprioception and build a more resilient body. Because I'm from a gymnastics background, it's easier for me to understand this. So there are certain things in gymnastics where you have to learn to kind of yield your whole body into the floor and like roll and spin and kind of let go. And then there's other times where you have to create a ton of tension to be able to like power yourself off the ground into a double back flip or whatever the activity is. And so a lot of what that sport is teaching is the ability to create co-contractions and then the ability to yield. And I think that's why gymnasts I can pick on in particular can do these incredible feats, because that has become a standard of how they learn movement. Not as much on the, like, I guess, being nitpicky about the coaching, but sort of it's like a skill development over time. And we can give that to everybody. It's a possibility for everybody. So this is from Franz Bosch's book, and that book is so good. He kind of got a little bit of, I guess like the reviews weren't as great for this one, which is interesting. But I personally, so this is his first book, The Strength Training and Coordination. And then this is Anatomy of Agility. And I actually loved this book. The way he talks about the muscle spindles and then the muscles, like in terms of being biotensegrity, units of their own, was something that I've never heard a strength and conditioning coach talk about. And it just fascinated me. So I recommend both. Obviously, if you want a background into his information, then get the first book, because that's what I think he's been teaching about for probably the longest. So speed is not simply generated by performing the fastest possible concentric muscle action, but above all by distributing the movement over as many joints as possible. Co-contraction, tension, taking muscle slack out. So that limitation of performance in one joint is postponed as long as possible. Speed is thus a function of coordination. And sport-specific strength training is therefore essential to make a distinction between speed, strength, and coordination as late as possible when constructing thinking models. The longer the interconnections between the various components of training design are maintained, the better. So he's kind of making a case for, and this is more in the strength and conditioning world, performance world, for everything staying as connected and full body as possible to help with creating that tension and creating those co-contractions for as long as possible before starting to break things down. Like in a traditional, I was an student athletic trainer at Florida State. And, it was very like you're in the gym doing your strength training. It's a lot of like, yes, there's compound lifts, but there's also a lot of breaking down parts and there wasn't a whole lot of like using your body as a unit in that environment. I think that's changing quite a bit now, thanks to people like him. And I think it's also maybe what's lacking in the general population. Like when I go to the gym, I don't see a whole lot of people jumping and moving their body as a unit and working on. You might have maybe a handful of people that are doing like uh, more like power training and stuff like that. But because I work out in a more commercial gym, the reality is that 90% is still a lot of that traditional strength and conditioning, bodybuilding type work. Again, nothing wrong with that. But I think if you can help people understand that this is going to improve their connective tissue and help their bodies function for a much longer time in their life than just doing basic strength training. Okay. And breaking down into parts. So, what is a co-contraction? It's basically the contraction of agonist and antagonist opposing muscles during rapid movement to ensure necessary stiffness and spring actions around a joint. In conclusion, we have shown that muscle co-contraction accelerates dynamic motor learning despite reducing kinematic errors. So even without giving that feedback or trying to change the movement, getting better at creating co-contractions throughout the entire body will increase adaptations and help with motor control in general in life. So they therefore improves both kinematic accuracy and dynamic learning, simultaneously enhancing present and future motor performance. So when I was at the medical university training for years, like 15 years, towards the end of my time there, they started a program for Parkinson's. I can't remember the name of it, but it is popular in the US now, and it's a boxing program. And when I think back, I think about like how that must impact the brain and their ability to create that stiffness and that motor control. And that in a way that strength training never could. And I haven't ever looked into the research, but it makes sense why these people are getting better with activities like that and then neural circuitry and how that impacts the brain versus strength training. So at some point, I'm going to really dive into it. But sometimes when I get down rabbit holes, I don't come out of them for a little while. So let me just give a couple examples of co-contractions. I need to redo these videos just because they're out in my backyard during COVID. But we all have them, right? So this is just kind of a baseline co-contraction. You guys, if you're doing the programming, have seen these in the programming. So it's just that lower limb there is creating stiffness, and I'm extending the hip. I've got quads, hamstrings, calves, all on to stabilize the knee. And the area of the lower limb, I think, is the most interesting because so many people can't create that stiffness in the knee. And they're either hanging out on their joints and locking their knees all the time, or they're constantly flexing through their knee to try to extend their hip instead of extending the hip and maintaining a knee that is in a relatively like neutral position or slightly flexed position. So they don't ever get good hip extension. They're just getting a lot of quad dominance trying to create the motion at the hip. This is just an example of one on the ground. So I'm kind of doing the same thing. My heel's elevated. This would be sort of a beginner version. I'm going into a bridge, lifting the hip, extending, but notice my knee isn't really changing position. So muscle slack and hamstrings are really important. Obviously, we talk about the importance of hamstrings. Sina, you just posed the question about like using the hamstrings to help pull the pelvis underneath us. But also, when we go forward and we're doing something like that co-contraction, we need to learn how to create tension in the hamstrings and take up that slack when we move into that kind of hingy position. And if our hamstrings are more lax, I'm going to have to go into much more of a hinge position to take up all that slack to be able to get that tension, to be able to propel forward. So it's something you can learn, but it's also something that needs to be trained. so that the tendon itself becomes a little stiffer so that it's easier to take that slack out over time because it's not like we have to go in these end ranges. So one of the things I'll do with people who can't feel their proximal hamstrings in like a 90-90 exercise is I will put them in a big anterior tilt with a towel or just tell them to anteriorly tilt and then drag their heels down. Because by putting them forward, I'm taking slack out of the hamstrings, and then all of a sudden they can feel their proximal hamstrings. And then I'm like, okay, let's keep that on and then go into a tucked and untucked position so you can dynamically feel that control. And then we want to teach them how to do that in all of these different dynamic ways so they can do it quick. And that's gait, right? That's walking, that's running. That's why walking can hurt because you're moving much faster now. And the hamstrings don't have that ability to create that coordination and that co-contraction. Sorry, I sometimes don't even read these slides. I just talk. So this is from Anatomy of Agility. So what he's saying is that muscles don't shorten and lengthen like we've all been told. It's actually a widening of the muscle belly. So as you can imagine, on one end, we have tendons, on the other end, we have tendons, and they're connecting the muscle to the bone. And as the muscle shortens, which is really just a widening, and you can remember the Graham-Scar stuff in our infrasternal angles and all that, that's happening at a muscular level. So as everything widens, it pulls thing into a wider angle. And remember that wider angle is seeking that whatever is 60 degrees. And so it's wanting to pull back. And so that pull is happening on the tendon units. And those tendons, if they're stiff enough, can become like springs that are free energy that go back to their normal resting position. And from that pull down to the resting position is where we get a lot of free energy and we don't have to use ATP. And it's not a hard muscular contraction. It's just a completely different experience. And most people, because they don't know this exists and they don't know that tendons store and release energy, they don't realize how important it is to train those properties. And yes, strength training does improve them, but there are so many other ways that we can create that connection that also improves motor control and coordination. And if you want someone to not fall and have an injury, it's the quickest way to improve the likelihood that they won't get hurt, especially as they age. So what is muscle slack? It's the ability to co-contract. It's not just the sum of how much force an athlete can place on their muscles, but a skill in its own right. The skill must be trained separately if we are to shift the boundary of performance skill. So that if I said right here, like, I want you to just put your arms out as quickly as you can and tense and stop. How quickly can you create that tension in your entire body is really what's important in terms of performance. But performance these days to me is training. I don't live in the world of like performance is only for athletes. It's for everyone. So limiting muscle slack with a small counter movement. So I gave the example of kind of hinging forward. That's the counter movement. And then going into hip extension will allow for storage of elastic energy. So we get kind of that eccentric lengthening or the tug on the tendon. And then we get that elastic component of the muscles recoiling, but also the tendon recoiling or springing back to its position. Training them isometrically can be helpful for improving that recoiling and that stored elastic energy. Maximal strength training at optimal length is going to help with the tendons. The hamstrings must extend the hip and resist knee extension. So distally, when we can create a co-contraction at the knee, we have tension in both the distal and the proximal hamstrings. And the distal are preventing that knee extension so we can extend from the hip instead of just the knee. So I put this in here, but I think it's kind of dumb that I put it in here. It is something I have read, but leg curls may reduce coordination. And so I don't even know if this is in your slides, but if that is all you're training. So we think, oh, like leg curls, right, is so important, but really it's a lot more to do with the whole system and not just the parts. But I use leg curls all the time for certain things with people to train hamstrings. Okay, so they're perfectly fine exercise to do. The pelvis has to be able to rotate and orient in all directions to optimize hamstring length. So if we have a pelvis that can't get into that posterior orientation or anterior orientation or can't move in internal and external rotation, it just becomes a little harder in terms of hamstring length. And you can also think about more medial or lateral hamstrings too. So if I'm in this sort of ER pelvis all the time, my lateral hamstrings may be working a ton and I'm having a hard time getting the medial hamstrings to help out with stabilizing the pelvis or vice versa. Okay. There is a high correlation between poor control of the pelvis in flight phase and hamstring injuries. Why? Because if my pelvis is in a big anterior orientation and I'm already got that slack taken out and I go through swing phase and I'm going to heel strike, I'm now creating tension up against the bone over and over and over until I've just created so much compliance that I get either some sort of tear in the hamstring or tendinopathy from repetitive strain. So when you see hamstring recurring issues with somebody, they probably need to have more of a connective tissue approach to their training. And if you see hamstring strains, they probably also need a connective tissue approach to their training. It's just on the former, we're talking more about creating stiffness, and on the latter, and the ability to withstand forces. And on the latter, we're talking more about creating more compliance in the tissues so that they can yield easier. So these are more kind of strength-based. So even like that's a split squat, but like a squat clean position where I'm dropping down. So in order, that's the pre-tension there, and then I'm dropping down and yielding into it. So the tissues need to have that balance within them. But that initial part where I'm hinging forward is limiting the muscle slack and creating the counter movement that otherwise I wouldn't be able to lift whatever weight that is all the way up to my shoulders. It's the connective tissue that's helping me do that. My muscles aren't strong enough to just take that bar and lift it up without a counter movement. And here's kind of a more strength-based, could call this a Bosch clean or heel elevated hinge to the wall, whatever you want to call it. But the idea is I'm getting that, limiting that muscle slack and creating that counter movement from there and then propelling forward. So a case for sport-specific strength training. Intermuscular refers to a group of muscles working together to complete an action or generate force. Gymnastics is sort of the iron cross is probably the epitome of creating co-contraction within the body. There's no way they can do what they do on these rings without being able to create that tension because everything else is moving. The rings are always moving until they create the tension and stop the rings from moving. So it's just kind of a neat way to, if you ever watch gymnastics, to look at it. Intramuscular refers to a single muscle's action or ability to create force. Traditional approaches to strength training versus sport-specific training. Have we gone too far away from sport-specific? And is it impacting our motor learning? And this is where coaching is an art because a lot of people will come to the gym because they have aesthetic goals. Now, if you guys are in this course, you probably get more people that are having body issues and having injuries and want more from their training than just necessarily aesthetics. And there's nothing wrong with wanting the aesthetics too, but I think we can do both. And we can explain to people if we do this, it's going to help in this way so that you can build more muscle. It'll help your body in the long term so you don't get injuries, you don't get setbacks, and then you continue to progress forward. And it's the same thing, like, and definitely not all physical therapy, but in kind of traditional physical therapy, there it kind of stops at like we're doing clamshells and getting the hamstrings working, and but then we're never standing up and kind of coordinating all of it together. I know so much is changing in PT, and I am not in bodybuilding, so I recognize that I cannot speak on that. But in general, like when people go to the gym, a lot of times they're doing back and biceps, chest and triceps, quads and hamstrings. And it's like, well, we all know it's more than that in terms of recreational sports. And if you look at something like I started playing pickleball like a year and a half ago, and that's a great example of people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s who are running around on a court chasing balls and moving very dynamically. And we see so many injuries because they haven't trained, yet they're doing this sport that requires really quick dynamic movements and their connective tissues can't handle it. Like I saw this woman, super fit, plays a ton of pickleball, but I guarantee she doesn't do a lot of yielding or strength training because we were on the court and I literally saw her go down and I sat her down on the side and I looked at her Achilles and I felt it and I was like, she completely tore her Achilles. And I said, she asked, and I was like, yeah, I think it's torn. And she said, well, I've had this happen before. And it was just like a little bit of a tear. And literally, it was not on the bone. It's like, no. But what happened is that Achilles at a certain point couldn't withstand the push and pull dynamic on the court. And it didn't have the ability to have compliance. Then you add in all the hormones and those tissues are struggling even more. And she's probably not training the foot and the dorsiflexion to allow the Achilles to just yield in something like an eccentric, isometric, overcoming, like whatever it is to allow the Achilles to stretch and be fluid. And like this silly putty, instead, it's not as fluid like, and then it snaps. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with, especially as we start getting into that older population. And I'm just picking on pickleball because it's popular, but people are doing all kinds of stuff as they age. I think things are changing so much in terms of wanting to be very active for a long time. At least I hope, right? So, how do we program? We can use warm-ups to build a foundation. You see that a lot in EP when it says like knee health. Really, that's just kind of teaching heels off the floor, more of a co-contraction type position. You can do that in supine, use isos, tempos, more dynamic supine, and then you can get into that kind of hip lock position that we saw with me doing the co-contraction to the wall. You can use it in your accessories, like even just doing a heel elevated hinge and then adding load to it. You can do it prior to agility work, which I find really helps people feel springier when they're about to do agility or jumping activities. And prep for sprinting is really good. Or if they're distance runners, like give them as their warm up, like 3 sets of some kind of co-contraction and creating that stiffness in the lower limb. So then it's that motor control is there when they're going out for a run. We can do it in their main lifts. cleans, Bosch cleans, snatches. If somebody's up for that type of training, can absolutely. And I did Bosch cleans, single arm dumbbell. I had in my groups, I had a 78-year-old woman that was doing 35-pound Bosch cleans with dumbbells, and it's cool because I remember when I first started introducing this stuff to my clients, it felt awkward. Like we're in the gym and like, do I look silly doing this? Can my body really coordinate this? But it's amazing. And then once people realize what it's like to feel powerful in your body and athletic again, it really empowers them to want to keep training. I like using it in conditioning for some anaerobic, like it gets the heart rate up, right? If I'm doing things that I'm stiffening up my whole body, everything's working, my heart rate's going. Can do like 15 seconds on or 5 reps, heart rate gets up, let the heart rate come down. It can even be modified, lower level type stuff and used in aerobic circuits. And then, of course, I believe it's for everybody, not just athletes. So I'm just going to go over some progressions. So we saw that heel elevated hinge where you're just going down and up, but you could progress that to something like a hop here. You could make that a little bit of a stiffer hop, more like a pogo if you wanted. This would require more hip extension because I'm on the ground. So can I push up and lift and get that full hip extension and then also maintain the ball so I'm getting a little more of that distal hamstring to kick on? This one's an EP, just one of the warm-up drills. Can I extend from the hip, keep my knee bent? Here's a weighted wall hinge. Can I come up, extend the hip without locking the knee? And now I'm adding load to it. Using a cable. So lots of different varieties to start to train this stuff. These are just kind of dynamic progressions. So you could start, and this is where I start with a lot of people. See how I'm just stepping forward? It looks relatively simple, but I've got the co-contraction. I'm practicing extending from the hip instead of the knee. This is achievable for everybody, should be. And then it gets a little harder as I go to a step. So a little more hip extension required, not locking the knee. Then I can take it to a wall, more hip flexion on that opposing leg, more hip extension, same thing, just getting harder. So you could see over time, maybe every 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, whenever you change someone's program, you kind of up the level as you go. And then you can add even things. I'm not going to go through all these, but like a hop to a co-contraction. So having to create that transition. So I'm not necessarily going into like a pogo where there's a lot of impact, but it's just like that single hop. And then can I move forward? You can do change of direction. I'll show you just one more, but like I can do kind of a skater and then to the wall. So moving from that lateral motion and then into the sagittal plane. So kind of frontal to sagittal, which I think that's pretty helpful for people too, because they're not used to that. And then in terms of main lifts, well, I already showed you that one, but even something like doing a full clean with a barbell, I added a step up on this, but you kind of get the idea. You can make these as difficult as you want. And I will say, like, when you're working with people who've never done this and aren't interested in Olympic lifting, there's no need to have to do like a bilateral stance. In fact, I think it's a lot harder on people in terms of their positioning, especially if they have a lot of twists and turns. It can really aggravate their low back or their SI joints. So I find the single leg version, and again, you don't have to use a barbell. You could have 15 pounds in either hand and do this exact same thing, right? I'll come back to this and we can look at other examples, but I want to go through the tendon health stuff. So tendon strength is different than muscle strength. Tendons need both fast and slow training to optimize their resiliency. Fast exercise increases stiffness and slow exercise decreases stiffness. Stiffness is not bad. Compliance is not bad. They both are needed to create really good structure and resiliency. So they don't grow in size, but they get good at absorbing and releasing energy. The stiffer the tendon, the better the return on energy. So when you see like a basketball player, when they're jumping up, and a lot of times, like when they're dunking, it's a short, stiff movement. It's not like they're going into this deep squat to create this rebound. It's not muscular. It's all coming from their connective tissue, and they get really good at it. So the more they do, the more you become stiffer, faster, and fast movements, again, keep going with the stiffness. But if they're never training that compliance, what's going to happen? A healthy tendon is more compliant near the muscle and becomes stiffer as it nears the bone. The compliant region, so the muscle and the tendon unit, is going to protect the attached muscle from injury by acting as a shock absorber. But when it's too stiff at that muscle tendon unit, we're going to end up with more of like a muscular strain is going to be more likely because the tendon's so stiff, it's not having any give, and then it's a sharp pull on the calf, let's just say. Okay. So that's why you'll also see more muscular type injuries, muscular strain type injuries in certain sports versus tendinopathy type injuries. Okay. So the tendons also need slow contractions to decrease stiffness. Isometrics are the slowest movements. Eccentrics work. It all works. You just got to do a little bit of both of it. Connective tissues adapt much quicker than muscles. Regular exposure can help with rehab, unlike muscles that might need more rest. Passive approaches do not work with tendon injuries. So if you have a client and their doctor, meaning well, says to rest and they have a tendinopathy, don't listen to them. Pull out some research and show your client because it's just going to get worse. So the idea is that you kind of expose the tendon to some sort of strain or tension. And then if the person feels better in 24 hours, you can start adding to that. If they feel worse or they have pain, you could use like a 0 to 10 score with them. But it's just like slight, they're probably still okay. If they have a lot of pain, maybe you're backing off and the next time you meet and what you give them as their homework is a little bit less. So it's kind of exploratory. So there's tensile, which is just like pulling on the tendon like a rubber band. Compression, think squashed against the bone. It obviously depends on where we're talking about in the body, but if you imagine doing like a forward fold or the example of heel strike in terms of the hamstring tendon, that's going to be compression. And that's why in yoga, because there's a lot of compression over and over again, and that's a more compliant type activity, we see a lot more tendinopathies. A combined load of the two, both tensile as compression, will get that compression on the joint and recoil with fast movement and range of motion increase. So a co-contraction at the hamstring is a great example, kind of hinging forward, taking out the muscle slack. It's creating some compression, but it's also a tensile force as well. Shearing is going to be like our cutting and side-to-side movements. Super helpful, especially if you're kind of working with someone that maybe has had like an ankle sprain and they've gotten through kind of the initial healing phase and they've gone through, the spring-like and the tension and the compression, and they're able to kind of do that, then maybe you start adding some of the shearing load side to side and see how their connective tissue can handle that. So in terms of working with this, give 24 hours after loading to see the response. And, it's hard to say exactly, but if you did like 3 sets of, say, isometrics are pretty safe. Okay. So I do 3 sets of like a 45 to 60 second isometric where I'm just taking out some slack and putting some tensile force into the tendon or some compressive force. And then text your client the next day, how's it feeling? Good, feels good. Okay, that's safe. Can you do that 4 times tomorrow and see, like, continually loading to see how they do? Obviously, muscle strength is imperative. It helps us handle the load and increases the stiffness in the tendon. So just by strength training, we're helping the tendons. And then plyometrics are really important, both for the tendon and the bone health. So hysteresis is just the amount of energy lost between stretch and recoil. And the plyometrics help reduce hysteresis. So the way I think of it is like if I'm jogging and I don't have a lot of stiffness and I can't really generate that tension from the lower limb, then I'll kind of look like my foot is like heavy, like smacking the ground a little bit, not like I'm light and springy. And it kind of looks the same when people start plyometrics because they just don't have that capacity yet. And so they look really sinky when they're doing pogos and they should feel a little bit stiffer. So as you both use that closed loop control mechanism and you're teaching them how to stay stiffer, but also as their connective tissue becomes more able to handle those forces, then they can actually get springier in their bodies as well. So chicken or the egg, you're going to want to do both. So this was a study with Keith Baar. And if you look up Keith Baar, Baar, he has a ton of information on connective tissue health. But what you'll see here is that we're looking at a healthy tendon over here or a tendon after 5 weeks of being immobilized. So in the healthy tendon, the muscle end of the tendon stretches much more than the bone end over here. So remember, we want stiffness at the bone end, and as we move along the tendon and it's attaching to the muscle, we want more compliance, and that creates a healthy tendon. And when you immobilize it, you lose that compliance. And what is the one way to get the compliance back? The slowest movement. And the slowest movement is an isometric. So isometrics would be really great in that case to start with. We obviously want to start doing more dynamic activities and creating more stiffness. But in general, if you're thinking about it on a scale. So estrogen impacts the tendon. It inhibits lysyl oxidase, which is the cross-linking enzyme for collagen synthesis, and that means more stiffness. Women's tendons are less stiff, and sometimes that can impact their performance. So they tend to have less muscle pulls and more ligament injuries. So when we see female soccer players with all these ACL injuries, especially around their high school years and their middle school years, it may not be because they have a valgus presentation of the knee, because we have a greater Q angle. It might be because they're going through becoming a woman and releasing all those hormones. And all of a sudden, we're inhibiting that lysyl oxidase because the impact of the estrogen, and then that changes throughout the cycle. So if you do work with females in this kind of stage of life and you're in performance, or even if you're just working with them, like, it would make sense to maybe even track some of those things. And maybe even, work from that connective tissue perspective to help make sure that we're, having that collagen turnover. And then there's so much out there about, saw the chat go off. I'm gonna pull it up, about nutritional aspects of this. Yeah, and they love to stretch and hold. Yeah, and that's not really helping the situation, right? And so explaining to them that the activities where we go contract and jump, and that's actually more active type stretching, probably is going to carry over so much better to prep for their sport. Yes, I think it is, Ginger, except when we go through menopause, it's the loss of many different hormones. So I think it's just a loss of that elasticity, like overall. And women will say to me, like, I feel so stiff. I never felt so stiff as I do now. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, that's why they're coming out with like all the studies with hormone replacement therapy, because we're finding out that it's actually really beneficial and not as dangerous as we once thought it was. And it's probably for some of these reasons because it's keeping our connective tissue healthy as well, which kind of makes sense, right? And also, like, even if you think of like pregnancy, it's a great one. All of a sudden relax. Well, it's just this influx of hormones that's creating more compliance. So what can we do to support a pregnant woman during that time? Give them things that make sure that their tissues stay stiff and they also have that property. And of course, that might look different when somebody's in their third trimester, but there are ways to do it. Yeah, drying out. It is a thing. All right. So, just to kind of keep it simple in terms of how to use this information, I generally am doing both. With a healthy person, I'm meeting them on both sides of the coin. If they have more laxity and they have a diagnosis of hypermobility, maybe I'm doing things that are more overcoming. If they're healthy, I'm doing yielding and overcoming and kind of explain what that is. So, yielding is holding a load, like holding two weights in your hands and just resisting those eccentric forces. So, as I do that, the imagine that muscle picture again. It's expanding, it's pulling on the tendon, and it's creating more compliance and eccentric strength. So the muscle is slowly shortening while the tendon is slowly lengthening. And then the sliding of the collagen fibers breaks the cross links that each fiber has with one another, which then decreases the stiffness of the tendon and improves its health via creep. And it makes the muscle tendon unit more compliant. It also improves the neural connections in a movement, and it eliminates the use of momentum to cheat a rep by bouncing out of the bottom. So if you've ever seen somebody squat and they go all the way down, but they kind of bounce, obviously, if you're doing something more yielding and eccentric, you can't do that. So many different ways you could create that yielding. Whereas overcoming is I'm pushing against a wall or an immovable object and resisting that object. And that creates a bigger impact on concentric strength. And it teaches the nervous system to engage the muscles as fast as possible in order to apply as much force as possible. So you're looking at maximal intent, more taxing on the nervous system, but you can recruit more muscle fibers by recruiting more motor units. So think of like if I've got my feet on the floor, I'm pushing as hard as I can into a wall, I'm creating a full body co-contraction, and all of those motor units are coming on board. So greater potential for strength and power outcomes. So let me pull this up. I'm just going to move things around a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a few of these. You know what? I need to, well, I'll think about that later. But see, I'm just holding a weight. It's isometric, creating yield in the patellar tendon, quadriceps tendon, maybe Achilles tendon a little bit. So something super simple like this. Doesn't have to be very complicated. I could use like a rear foot elevated position, opening up the back of the pelvis on one side. Imagine I have that tendinopathy. in the hamstring. This would be like kind of an advanced version. Maybe I started in an all fours position, just loading into the hamstring, creating a little compressive and tensile load. And now I'm moving up to something weighted like this, where I'm getting that same load. The longer you hold it, any of those kind of damaged cross links will actually be able to take on the load and regenerate. That's why the isometrics are so important, because if you're only holding something for 20 seconds, those damaged crosslinks don't come on board. All the healthy part of the tendon is going to be getting better, but the unhealthy part of the tendon is not. So the isometrics make it so the less health or the more healthy are at their max capacity because they've been working all the time, and then the less healthy can kind of regenerate. How would that be on all four? What do you mean, Rodrigo? All fours. Yeah. So imagine you're in like a bear position, and then you put your toes on the wall to get your hamstrings on, and then you just kind of tilt your pelvis forward. That's kind of tugging on that tendon. Does that make sense? So you're just like generating tension.
In more anteriorly tilt of the pelvis, right?
Yes. Yeah. So that would be probably a little more overcoming, but still you could hold an isometric like that. It's pretty gentle. And then just see how somebody does with that. If they're good, then you can start moving up into like a hinge position. And of course, if it's one side or the other, you can do single leg and kind of play around with that. So this is just an overcoming wall hinge. So I'm pulling up against basically an immovable object because this is so thick, this super band, and I can only probably hold it for 15 or 20 seconds. And this is where you can get kind of creative. So in this position, my knee is going down below the opposite knee. So it's creating kind of more internal rotation on this side. I'll get a little more medial hamstring, hopefully. And then I could do something different here. And this one, I'm moving away from the femur. So now that's more of an EARD position, maybe getting a little more lateral hamstring. And they may have that problem with the tendon on more the medial or lateral. So you could get more specific. Does that make sense? And then also just positionally, like what their body needs. So something, this overcoming hinge with the bar might be a good superset. You do 15 or 20 seconds and then go into your heavy lift, getting those fast twitch fibers on, getting the nervous system revved up, pulling up as hard as you can, and then going to do your deadlift. So you can combine them into things.
Katie, when you had the previous exercise with the hinge at the wall and on the left hip, you were externally rotating and then you were dropping it down. That would be well suited for someone who has that left forward bias.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, then, so let me just say this doesn't exist in like the training world, this terminology. You will see yielding and overcoming in isometrics, but you won't see it explained like this in athletic movements or plyometrics. This is just the way that I choose to find all these boxes so that I can get my people to a place where their connective tissue can handle dynamic and plyometric activities. So I'm going to start with isometrics. Then I'm going to move into dynamic and athletic movements. And this is exactly how I did the programming in the fitness membership. So you can kind of see it phase to phase, how I did that, and just slowly kind of progressing. So when I think of dynamic movements, I think of things that maybe aren't necessarily jumping, but like a fast chop. that's still creating more tug in my mind on the connective tissue that the body has to kind of figure it out. And it's safe for people who are afraid to start doing jumping and plyos and kind of get their body prepped for the higher intensity stuff. So if they're doing good with this, go ahead and start jumping into the plyos. If they're healthy and they can do all this stuff, don't worry about it. Just pick a little bit of each of them to create the various components that they need. So yielding is good for someone who struggles with eccentric control in deeper ranges of strength and struggles to relax more in athletic movements. Think of yielding to gravity. So I have this squash tennis crazy squash player that I train, and he's wide ISA, stiff everywhere, muscular. And when I get him to try to do like a squatty jump where he just has to yield into the ground, it is like almost comical because he can't just let his body go. And he thinks he needs more stretching. But what he really needs is the yielding isometrics and then the yielding like dynamic movements to keep those tissues healthy, right? So that's just one example. So you're kind of loading the stretch portion of the stretch shortening cycle. So even a chop kind of dropping down would kind of load me down into the ground. Overcoming is going to be for someone who struggles with more concentric control. So the person who is really sinky can drop all the way into those squats, but can't really get that pressure pushing forward or up. So think of it from a pelvic floor perspective. If I can't do something more dynamic overcoming and push pressure up, my pelvic floor is having to work so much harder. So it makes sense that our pelvic floor symptoms we're having may not be a pelvic floor problem and might be a lack of ability to create more overcoming and stiffness in the body. So when you're working with someone who has pelvic floor symptoms, think about the connective tissue in the rest of the body and how you can support that so that they can actually yield in their pelvic floor the way they need to. So again, more concentric strength, great for muscle recoil and the elastic component, and also great for skill building for athletic movements. All right, so I'll show you a few of these. So, there's no right or wrong way, like however you think through this, but this is me. I'm not jumping off the ground, but I'm creating that kind of concentric pushing my center of mass forward, pushing the guts forward. So I think of this as a little more overcoming. I'm having to create that stiffness. I'm not yielding into the ground. And again, this is me just making stuff up. So if it doesn't resonate with you, call it something else. It doesn't really matter. This isn't playing. So here, see how I'm kind of hopping to come out and then pushing the pressure into the wall? A little more stiffness. My body's having to move. The quicker I'm having to move, the more stiff. And med ball throws are a great way to intro people to this. Obviously, that's plyometrics. I'm throwing the ball, but it's safe for a lot of people. Here's now getting more creative with like positional stuff in general. So right here, I just shifted over to my right side. I have a supinated reach on the left. So now it's rotating me back to the left, meaning my left foot, see, it's behind my right. So I'm creating a left turn with this offset squat. But more of my weight is on the right. So I'm having to yield on the right on this left side. I'm dropping down into the pelvic floor. I'm learning to let my connective tissue yield on that side. My foot, which is often more supinated on that side, to go into that pronation, my knee to bend forward and get into that deeper range. And I'm offset positionally. Now, do you need to get all these things at one time? No. Now I'm loading onto the left, and I'm doing kind of the same thing, but I'm yielding into that left side with it behind me, still turning to the left. Any questions about that? I know that's a lot to kind of process through.
Maybe one question, when you got a narrow type, is it easier for them to yield? And for the white ISA, easier to get stiff and overcoming?
Generally, yes, I will kind
Yeah.
of do that. But depending on the person, they may have created a lot of stiffness, say around the knee, because they were told never to push their knees over their toes. So they've avoided it for so long that now they don't have good compliance there anymore. Do you see what I'm saying? So depending and like where in the body it is can change. And not every narrow is, well, has a lot of laxity necessarily.
And maybe one question more, if we do it really quick and fast, how can we cue the breath, or should we cue anything
Yeah,
when it's
good question. I love that. So it is okay to cue inhale down and exhale up, or to cue exhale down, inhale up. So if I wanted to take out slack and generate more tension from the outside in, I would cue an exhale as I'm going down to help create that stiffness. And that could be on this. And now I'm like making them feel safe in their body. And then inhale as they come up. And these are, I'm not saying like on max lifts. Obviously, we use more of like a controlled kind of Valsalva type breath. But, and then if you think about the isometrics, so if I have someone that has a lot of laxity and then they struggle to say breathe down into their pelvic floor and relax the pelvic floor, and I create that overcoming tension using like a band under the feet and pull up, and then I have them inhale and say to relax the pelvic floor and inhale, they now can generate that pressure pushing down to relax it. And I could put them in a 90-degree position like a squat to help open up the sit bone. So now the pressure can go into the back of the pelvic floor versus exhaling in that position. I mean, you're inhaling and exhaling, but you kind of get what I'm saying. Like I could emphasize more of the inhale to create that yield. Here's something kind of simple you could start somebody out with, where you just come up to your toes and then go into a reverse lunge where the pressure is kind of pushing back. This would be like a lot more advanced because I'm pushing away and landing into a push up, but you could do like a kneeling push up and then drop down into it kind of quickly. You can think of all the different progressions you could take somebody through. Maybe I have that Achilles issue and I want them to be able to eccentrically load. See how I'm kind of yielding and just dropping the heels down, but a little bit faster. So I had an Achilles injury. I didn't, but I'm just saying, let's say someone had an Achilles injury and then I'm starting with isometrics. They're good with that. Now I'm doing something more eccentric dynamic. And then I'm doing something more plyometric, like say, I don't know, a depth drop. Then I'm doing something more overcoming, like a depth jump, where I'm not just yielding into the ground, but I'm like actually having to now produce that second jump and that force production out of it. Does that make sense? So you could kind of move them all the way along that spectrum over time. Okay. All right. And then lastly, this is our last slide, is if a runner has proximal hamstring issues when running uphill, are they likely in more anterior pelvic tilt with their center of mass shifted forward and they may lack proper hip extension? Should I start with iso hold and after a wall hamstring exercise are suitable for activating the hamstrings and then start with weights? Okay, so let's break this down. If a person is running uphill, it's requiring more hip flexion, which means that the hamstring tendon is getting more compressive force as they're running uphill. If they are also more shifted forward, and so let me just say this, if they're shifted forward, meaning their pelvis is more forward, their rib cage more flared, they're going to be limited in hip flexion and hip extension. Okay. So should I start with an ISO hold? Let me just look. Is there hamstring? Is it a hamstring strain or is it more of a tendinopathy type hamstring issue? So start with that first. No, I know that it hurts. It's probably my best guess is more of a tendinopathy type situation. If it's like way high up and they're pointing towards their sit bone. So in that case, I would start with an isometric for sure. And I would take them to the range where they feel it. Let's say you're in like a wall hinge isometric. Go to the range where they feel it and then back off like 10% of that just right before where they feel it. Have them do a 60-second hold and then ask them how it feels. If you didn't go past the point of irritation, it likely will actually make it feel better because you just created some compliance and there's less irritation. If it was too much, maybe you have to start with something easier, like a supine, long lever bridge, and maybe like taking them into an anterior tilt into the point where they feel it, and then just backing them off a little bit from that. Then hold it for 60 seconds. How does that feel? Great. That feels great. Okay. We're going to do that. I want you to do that maybe a few times tomorrow as your homework and let me know how it goes. That's kind of how I would play around with that because a lot of this is like so exploratory. There's no manual for this kind of stuff. But and then from the ISO, then you can move them through all of these various loading parameters. So you could maybe do something yielding ISO, overcoming ISO, see how they respond, then move to the dynamic stuff when they start to feel better. Because even though they feel better and they're not having as much pain, when you start to increase the stress that maybe they're not putting on it at the moment, but they might when they start to decide to hike a 13er and then they expect their body to perform, you still want to get it to a place where it's ready for something more intense. Hope that makes sense. So in terms of plyometrics, we have extensive and intensive. So your extensive are going to be more horizontal. So think of kind of like moving across the ground. Pogos, broad jumps, hops, leaps, bounds, more locomotive, less ground reaction force. The muscle needs less stiffness and it makes it stiffer at the bone and the muscle junction. So in terms of intensive, like depth jumps and more vertical bounds and leaps, there's more ground reaction force and the muscle needs less stiffness. So it kind of has to have this ability. I mean, and that's kind of on a spectrum, right? Because you kind of have to yield into a depth jump and then be able to rebound back up more than like when you're doing a pogo, you're not really yielding. It's just like popping up off the ground. So in terms of plyometrics, it's going to be dependent on the person, how healthy their tissues are, how much exposure they've had to jumping in their life. But in general, start with kind of the lighter, extensive plyos like pogos, low skips. If you're dealing with someone who's symptomatic with pelvic floor, go to the pelvic floor emotion course and kind of hear me talk about that because pogos are not their friend. It can really trigger that fatigue of the pelvic floor and then just everything lets go. Of course, you can modify that getting adductors on, squeezing a ball, using the wall for a little support, unweighting a little bit with like a TRX. But generally, I find that doing things like a skater might be an easier place to start versus that stiffer component when their pelvic floor isn't quite ready for that stiffness, or the body isn't ready for the stiffness and the pelvic floor is trying to do all the work. That's where like the dynamic stuff can really come into play. The dynamic overcoming activities are usually safe. So starting with that kind of like co-contraction to the bench, co-contraction to the wall, that's creating stiffness in the lower limb, but it's not requiring that ground reaction force that they're not ready for. And in those, you can coach inhale, relax the pelvic floor. You don't necessarily have to say that. And then exhale, propel fast. And as they get good at those things, I see a lot of decrease in symptoms. So gradually increase the intensity via volume and height or distance, or moving from bilateral to unilateral. Following extensive, we can go more towards intensive, bilateral, and unilateral. All right, let me check the chat. Let's see. Can you explain what's going on in the proximal hamstring tendon and long lever bridge? Yes. So it's going to be in a more of a shortened position, assuming you're tucking under in that long lever bridge. If you can coach it, like untuck in the long lever to get the proximal hamstring on board for people who like can't sense that and all they feel is the lower hamstring working or the calf. You know how some people will do that and they're like, I just feel my calf and like down here in my hamstring, I don't feel the proximal. So if you take them forward and back a few times, a lot of times that will just kind of kick it on. It's also positionally going to help with kind of that hip extension. And you can even guide the foot. So if I were to find kind of the outside of my heel and then kind of go from outside to my first met head, I can feel more of that lateral hamstring. Whereas if I start on the inside of my heel and then go into the first met, a lot of times people will feel more of their medial hamstring. So if someone, just food for thought, so your brains can start going down these rabbit holes. But if someone has a lack of hip extension and internal rotation because they're already very internally rotated at the femur, so, you know, the knees are coming in. So when they extend their hip, it goes like way into internal rotation and they're kind of at end range. And a lot of times like pinching in the hip. I might use the first one where I'm finding the outside heel just to kind of get their femur to spin out so they get that sensation of the lateral hamstring helping out. But if someone struggles to find that internal rotation as they're going into toe off, maybe I'm using the inside heel. Kind of more of like the knees kind of bowed out a little bit more and real tight in the lateral or the lower glute area. So any exercise, when we talk about exercise selection, this is really what I changed in the presentation. So I used to take this approach of kind of like these exercises might be a little better for narrow type bodies and these for wides. And while we can use that, the truth is every exercise should be appropriate for every individual. It's just how we cue it and the constraints we use that slightly tweak it so that it makes more sense and achieves a goal. But the more variety we can expose people to in terms of movement, different patterns, different variations, in my opinion, the more variability at the joint level that we're also improving. Just like you wouldn't tell somebody to do yoga 5 days a week or Pilates 5 days a week, by doing different activities throughout the week, their movement variability, the joint ranges of motion will improve over time. What other questions do you guys have?
According to this you just said, is it like I was thinking about because I do boxing and I also teach boxing classes. So I started to thinking about how to implement this on my boxing courses, and maybe I should use all of this stuff. Or do you think I should start with something more like isometrics? So I'm not sure. Or do you think I should play around with all of this stuff?
Well, I guess my question would be, are you having any connective tissue issues, joint otherwise, that are bothering your body?
Yeah. I think on my own I just yeah, so I think I'm like, yeah, I'm in a very hard valgus in my knee. So I got some tendon yes, I got some problems with my tendons. So yeah.
Okay, at the knee, like patellar tendon kind of stuff, or yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you're like kicking the band. I mean the bag.
Sorry.
Are you like kicking the bag? Like
Uh,
you're boxing. Are you using like a hard
yeah.
bag? Like a heavy bag?
I
Are you like boxing on a heavy bag?
yeah, or something like with the hand things like
Yeah, and so you're kicking those, right? With your foot? Or is
no, just boxing with the hands. So it's
okay,
more like
that's different. So I'm
yeah,
imagining you kicking and then it's creating a force into the patellar tendon, if that makes sense. So your knee is having to move around quickly, laterally, side to side, front to back, right, while you're boxing. So that's what's irritating it. So
yeah.
your knee's going into valgus. How can we get you positionally in a better position? This is great. Everybody can answer, by the way. I'm not like putting you on this. It's just that this is because this is the type of stuff you have to work through with people, right? So positionally, how can we get in her knee in a better position so it's not just falling in?
We could band it, provide
Okay, like
external.
yes, but if she can't, like just well, yes, we could band it. Yeah. So what would that give her? Yeah, we could find the outside of the heel, like in exercises. What does that do positionally to the femur?
More externally rotate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, from a pelvis position, what would help you get that external rotation, not just the femur? Okay, Anna. Yes. So a hip shift would create more posterior rotation of the innominate, which would put the femur in relative external rotation. Yes. And then the orientation, which Ashley just said, would be able to come back into more of a posterior orientation because as she goes into anterior orientation, the femurs go in. So we're looking at probably a posterior orientation, internal rotation, as well as femoral external rotation. So that's a positional thing that you can do to support the knee. Now, from a strength and connective tissue lens, what can you do? This is much harder to think through to support the knee. Maybe we start with the knee and then move up to the hip and pelvis. So what could we do to support her knee? Co-contraction. Yes. So we start to teach that knee to create stiffness before she does her boxing, but also in general within her training. Yeah, calf raises, all of that's going to drive kind of that external rotation. Some skaters, yep, now we're loading that medial and lateral capacity of the knee. Yep. Pogos, really anything that she can do that doesn't aggravate it, but helps her create that stiffness. Skipping, yep. So, in terms of connective tissue at the hip, based on what we said about position, what are some things that might help her be more stable at her hip and pelvis so that the femur is not just caving in? So we had, from a femur position, Ginger said external rotation. What muscle fibers could help her get more femoral external rotation? Posterior glutes, lateral hamstrings. Yes, you got it. So now if she has laxity there, what could we do to create more stiffness in those tissues? You got it. Overcoming type activities. So what would combine all of that? We're going back to the start. Co-contractions, extending from the hip, getting that good external rotation, strengthening those muscles, posterior glute, lower glute work to help stabilize that femur a little bit better. Making some more dynamic type activities, maybe a hinge pulling up on the band with a band around the knees, like Ginger said, like start working on that stuff. And then a lot of that is kind of encompassing both the pelvis, the hip, but also the internal rotation, the hip shift that Anna said. So positionally, the adductor, the medial adductor, could also help create that hip shift to provide her more IR too. So the adductors could play a role and help stabilize the whole pelvis, not just the glutes, but the adductors too. And then because you're probably moving around on your toes and your forefoot a lot more, the Achilles tendon, the calf strength, all of those will become important too to help stabilize the knee. And the calf is going to prevent that tibia from moving forward also excessively to help stabilize. Yeah. Does that all kind of make sense? How you can kind of backtrack and think through the why? Yeah. And you might not necessarily like do it in the session with the client, but when they note it, you can go back home and like think through, okay, what do I need to give this person? Yeah, I love that, Anna. A bridge with a block between the leg and then a calf co-contraction, and you can make it overcoming. Yeah, so you could get all of it at once. How long does it typically take for the pelvic floor to handle the jumping again? So when I start to teach them with a ball, is there a chance that they can make pogos again? Yes, absolutely. And I've seen this time and time again with students and clients. It's really going to depend, though, on their adherence to the exercises that you're giving them, of course, their homework and all of that. And then also, like, how symptomatic they are, like, how severe the prolapse or the incontinence is, that they have tearing or they postpartum. You know what I mean? So it's so hard to say, to give a time frame. I wish that it wasn't, but they're just, it isn't, you know, straightforward. And honestly, like every single time I think about that pelvic floor in motion mini course, I know I need to make that course like deep down, because there's not a lot of information out there from like a pelvic floor standpoint on programming beyond a little bit more of like a rehab, or else the other take is like, just lift heavy and your body will figure it out, and like don't be afraid. And it's like, yeah, I know some of it's like psychosomatic, but some of it is also positional and like connective tissue and the support system that the body has. Um, and that is on my list to start this year, but it's just a lot of work.
Katie, I have a question with, so, prolapse is very common postpartum, but I'm finding now that I'm working with more and more women in menopause, it's happening in menopause with the loss of our elasticity in our tissues. And so women who've maybe not even given birth but have not had any prolapse are now all of a sudden in their mid 50s and mid 60s experiencing prolapse. How do you approach the breathing, especially like encouraging someone to exhale, going down into a movement if they're vertical, knowing they might be dealing with prolapse?
So this could be like very controversial in a way if I just say this, but I feel like as women age, yes, it's hormonal in nature, but it's also that this type of training is completely subsided. The number of women that I work with that are in their 50s and tell me that they haven't jumped or done anything since their 30s. And it's also generational, so it's changing, right? As generations come through, like my generation, Gen whatever X or whatever I am, I feel like we kind of started to expect a little bit more. So I can't imagine being 50 and not being able to jump, right? But I think like if I look at my grandparents, like that was never something you would ever even consider, right? So it's slowly changing. And even my mom now, like seeing her play pickleball and staying more active in that way. So that's part of it, is just the loading changes. I think the hormonal component is huge. And so the body is not able to think of the pelvic floor as not just muscles, but a bunch of connective tissue as well. And whether it's stiffness or compliance, the collagen turnover has changed. The fascia is not able to be as supportive. And it's the same thing. It's balancing both the overcoming and yielding properties to help with that turnover. And I think this is the controversial part. When I look at women who are less active as they age, I see a lot of sway back, glute clenching. Like my own mother will say, "Why is my butt so flat?" I'm like, because over time, you're standing in a sway back posture, and now those muscles are tight and they're pushing the pressure forward. You see what I'm saying? And then so now you're managing pressure pushing forward and down to, on the bladder, on the uterus, lack of probably tissue integrity within the organs themselves, what's holding up the uterus, holding up the bladder, like internally, and then position, and then also the hormones. So it's like just like let's just put a bunch of gasoline on this and blow it up, And I know because like so many women told me, like, including family members, have had to, and my dad will say the number because he was an OB doing these surgeries, like on women in their 30s who he's seeing in their 70s and having to repeat the surgeries.
Well, I think this whole approach, I mean, it's even just if you think about all of it integrated, just teaching people to open up, make space in the back of the pelvic floor, learn and really develop that proprioception to know where the pressure is going within their own body and to master that pressure management, it all works together so well to take the load off the pelvic floor. So
Yeah.
is it fair to say that you wouldn't have any restrictions on, you would just start them at a very low level, engage their symptom management with the isometrics and the overcoming and yielding exercises?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. And I mean, if I'm looking at it like in terms of programming, just to try to give Julia like an answer, um, for the fitness membership, I did mostly isometrics and like building into some dynamic movements and strength work, obviously, for 10 weeks. Then moved into starting to increase that dynamic activity and light plyometrics with support for 12 weeks. And then the athletic phase is building up the plyometrics for another 12 weeks. And I felt like that was pretty safe. Now, of course, there's going to be outliers where that's too slow or too much, but I feel like I would imagine, even think about strength training. What do they say? Is it like 6 to 8 weeks where you start building, having some hypertrophy and muscle? Is that kind of like the guidelines if it takes that long, like of consistent strength training? And the connective tissue, because it turns over quicker, it even just if they're doing drills on their own at home, it should move faster if they're doing it regularly because it's not like a muscle where you need to give it like 24 to 48 hours and then it's recovered enough so that if you add more stress and load, it can like perform even more, right? And like recover and regenerate, rebuild. You can like load quite a bit on a regular basis if you wanted to make it happen quicker, I guess. I work with a lot of women of all ages who have prolapse, teaching them that intentional exhales can be supportive to the core and pelvic floor, and just getting them to breathe during exercise can be a game changer. Absolutely. Allowing them to feel solid in their body with movement instead of scared is huge. Yeah. Yeah. And it's really exciting that all this is coming about now. I mean, I think it's really exciting for everyone. And this goes for men too, because men are going to have pelvic floor issues that aren't related to prolapse and that sort of thing. But in terms of connective tissue standpoint, their pelvic floor can get very tight because it's doing too much work because the rest of the body isn't doing its job. And so it may be painful sex or trouble urinating or constipation or SI joint pain or low back pain. But if you can get them to release the tension there and then add in more support for the rest of the body, you can create a lot of change as well for them. Just generally, I think men tend to be a little more stiff as they age in a way. I mean, obviously women too with the hormones, but they need, I'd say, and most of the men I see need more compliance and more yielding type activities. And that could be different areas. Oh, good. You guys, my dad. He's funny. But he's seen a lot and he will tell you that he totally supports the pelvic health world and like wishes that there was more of that as he was, dealing with patients and like I mean, he was like, I don't know what to do, but I know the outcomes have to be better than what we're seeing. I mean, I think the robotic surgery changed a lot in terms of outcomes being better. But still, there's a long way to go. All right. So don't forget the notes and slides for next week and printing out the right ones. And then I think that's it. And we're sending an email Erica was writing up the email just with like everything that's left in the course, how long you guys have with the material, all of that, just so you have some information. Because I've been getting questions. All right. Have a good rest of your week. I'll see you next Tuesday. Bye, everybody.